Okay, welcome to the Quadruple D, and we've got quite an episode here for you. So, in this episode, I will discuss J.D. Vance, the Vice President of these United States, defending some Nazi punks after their texts were leaked. I'll discuss why their supposed jokes are not funny, especially in light of their proximity to power. I will also discuss the tech goblin known as Peter Thiel, and also JD Vance's buddy and another PayPal co founder named Ken Howery, and how this Ken Howery character that nobody's talking about might be tasked with eventually stealing Greenland and putting it into Trump's greasy and greedy clutches. So, on to the JD Vance thing and those leaked texts. Texts, that's kind of a hard word to say in plural. But anyway, a leaked Telegram logs thingy over 2,900 pages spanning several months paint a damning portrait of internal culture within the Young Republican National Federation. And that title already sounds a little bit scary, National Federation with young Republicans involved. It sounds creepy to me. But anyway, participants across New York, Kansas, Arizona, and Vermont repeatedly trafficked in anti-Semitic, racist, and misogynist material. Who's actually surprised about that out there? Well, I guess some people might be, but as somebody who's followed these types of people for a while now, I'm not at all surprised. Anyway, they were praising Hitler, which is apparently what a lot of Republicans are doing these days. They were joking about gas chambers, referring to black people as, and I'm quoting now, so don't go after me for saying this, but they referred to black people as monkeys, and they were glorifying sexual violence and urging political rivals toward taking their own lives and all sorts of stuff like that. So I am going to distinguish this between just being edgy and their actual views. And I'm going to reveal how these types of things, which a lot of people might just say are jokes, are actually no joke when it comes to these people having access to power and given their overall actual worldviews. So I don't see any signs that these were actually people employing ironic racism or anything like that. Like a lot of comedy throughout the decades has been at least sometimes stated as ironic racism, just being edgy content, but this is not quite that, okay? And it's it's one of those things where a person might hide behind just trying to look like they're edgy, but there's a distinction that can be made between that sort of content and what their real sort of worldviews are. So, despite the gravity of that, Vice President J.D. Vance has largely dismissed the revelations as the antics of youthful indiscretions. In an interview on The Charlie Kirk Show, he insisted participants were kids making edgy, offensive jokes, even though many are well into adulthood. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind here at all times. These actually were not just like kids on a playground being mean or something like that. No, these are people who have some life experience. They've been around long enough to know that they are expected to behave a certain way as they are adults. Anyway, J.D. Vance chastised media and political opponents for dwelling on, quote, what a bunch of young people say in a group chat, end quote, claiming such scrutiny risks ruining lives over stupid jokes, is what he called them. So, the whole thing is hiding behind humor, you know what I mean? That's what a lot of these people like to do. They'll say, "Oh, I was just joking." But at the end of the day, they're not just stupid jokes. They're actually, in a lot of cases, very clearly a part of their actual worldviews. So, public records show that 8 of the 11 operatives implicated are aged between 24 and 35, barely younger than Vance himself, who is actually 41 years old. Many hold or have held positions within government or party machinery. Keep that in mind. One is Vermont State Senator Sam Douglas. Another is Peter Giunta, former chair of New York Young Republicans, who lost his role as a legislative staffer after the leak. So, if these were just jokes, I mean, do you think even Republicans would be actually firing some of them for these texts? I don't think so. These I mean, these were some bad texts for sure. So the Young Republican National Federation, the GOP's organization for members aged 18 to 40, has called for immediate resignations from those implicated, condemning the statements as unbecoming of any Republican. Well, I guess the problem is they are increasingly not unbecoming of any Republican. But there's still some damage control underway from this because it really is one of those scandals that, I mean, you can add it to the pile of scandals, of course, but this could challenge the Republican Party as far as their overall messaging goes, because the Republican Party often wants to act as if we're not actually Nazis. We're not actually like the KKK or anything like that. We're totally different. That they'll point out that it was actually the Democratic Party that was pro segregation and whatnot. Well, okay, but then how come all of these Dixiecrats went over to the Republican Party, and how come they're the ones now defending the Confederate flag and all that kind of stuff? So the party of Lincoln has become the party of the neo Confederates and also the neo Nazis and whatnot. So it's going to further complicate their messaging after that. So numerous Republican figures echoed the demand for the people to be held accountable. Vermont's Governor Phil Scott urged Senator Douglas to step down, and New York Representative Elise Stefanik publicly condemned her party associates. And these are actually some good signs in a way, because it shows that they're at least somewhat trying to look like their party does not welcome racist sentiments or pro violence sentiments. But of course, that gets complicated by the Republican Party's overall messaging, which is very much pro racism and very much pro violence if you look at their not only statements, but their actual policies. So across the aisle, Democrats uniformly denounced the texts as evidence of systemic hate. Governor Gavin Newsom requested a congressional investigation, and Senator Chuck Schumer called for swift, unequivocal action. So rather than repudiate the content, he deflected by spotlighting the controversy surrounding Virginia Democratic candidate Jay Jones. Jones had once joked in texts that he would prefer to slay a Republican colleague than Hitler or Pol Pot. He'd rather, for some reason, I don't know what the point he was trying to make was, but he apparently was trying to say that he wished more violence upon his Republican colleague than he would on, those dictators, Hitler or Pol Pot. So it was a remark for which he apologized and said he accepted full responsibility. So yeah, I mean it's one of those things, the whataboutism is there, but at the same time, that there is some legitimacy to pointing out, hey, this person over here said something similar, and how come you're not condemning that as much? Like, Like I get the critique of the whataboutism, but I also understand the whataboutism at the same time. You know, if you're going to hold one group of people accountable, then you have to hold the other one. So Vance labeled Jones's comments far worse, well, they're not actually, and refused to join the pearl clutching over what kids say in group chats. So, okay, again, remember that they're not kids, you know, especially not all of them. Maybe a few of them were under 18. I don't know how many people were involved in all of these texts, but I've definitely heard some of what they were talking about. And I'm going to get into a little bit more detail on that later and how it ties into things like real world genocides when people, you know, can so easily joke about this stuff, especially when they are in the political party that is really spearheading a lot of violence throughout the world. So, from an informed lens, this episode reveals how institutional politics channels and normalizes violent and oppressive worldviews. The fact that these individuals see no incongruity in joking about genocide, sexual violence, and other violence while operating within electoral structures shows how state power is fettered less by moral boundaries than by optics. The tacit tolerance of such language, especially when rebranded as jokes, maintains hierarchical systems of race, gender, and violence. You know, that's what I'm trying to get at here. When Vance frames the incident as juvenile misconduct, he obscures the continuity between private hatred and public policy. Such language is not benign fantasy. It signals who is eligible for full human dignity, who is disposable, and who is a target. In liberal discourse, it might be masquerading as bad apples, but to organizers and radicals, you know, who are committed to liberation from oppression, it really reads as structural. It's an admission that reactionary, genocidal thinking is open terrain within power structures and is policed only when it threatens consensus and electoral victories. So keep that in mind. The leaked Young Republicans chat logs do more than reveal ugly private behavior. They send a message that genocide and large scale violence, when normalized among rising political actors, become part of the acceptable vocabulary of power. When one leader writes, "Everyone who votes no is going to the gas chamber," which is an actual one of those texts, and another asks, "Can we fix the showers? Gas chambers don't fit the Hitler aesthetic." Well, this is not dark humor in isolation, but the invocation of extermination. So I know I just made a rhyme there, but you know the point isn't just to be cute. You know, it's one of those things that just sounded right for me to say. So when such references are made casually, and when the Veep defends them as kids doing stupid things, you know, like an America's Funniest Home Videos sketch or video or whatever. Uh, well, that show wasn't a sketch show, but you know what I'm saying. When it's treated like, oh, they're just goofing around. Well, the boundary between rhetorical violence and actual state violence is blurred. Those private words cast a halo over violence. They say genocide is not off limits. Once the discourse is acceptable, the transition to action becomes less shocking. You know what I'm saying? So it can go from discourse to policy. So I'm going to look at how violent jokes map to violent power. So desensitization and symbolic permission actually can be factors here. Speech that trivializes mass murder or calls for genocide prepares the ground ideologically. When leaders tolerate or defend such speech, they tacitly grant permission to escalate. Once you can joke about gassing people in politics, you have loosened moral constraints on using the state itself to kill. So, state violence can also be disguised as necessity. So it, you know, gets culturally blended into necessity as well as a joke. Like the what happened in Nazi Germany is that people would trivialize the roundups and the murders and whatnot. They would see humor in it. They would normalize it, and of course the Nazi German government saw it as necessary at the same time. So of course most of the population did, and those who didn't want what was happening would just tend to keep their mouths shut, or they might end up disappearing. They might end up in the gas chamber themselves, or at least maybe in prison or something like that. So, in contemporary conflicts, genocide often proceeds under the guise of counterterrorism or security. For example, Israel's military campaign in Gaza is increasingly described by human rights bodies and UN experts as genocide, given the mass killing, mass displacement, siege, and deprivation of food, water, and health services. But they frame it as a necessity to do all that. And they also might joke about it too. So when a regime trains its discourse to dehumanize, justify collateral damage, and treat whole populations as targetable, the rhetorical step from jokes to atrocity narrows. And that's really what I'm getting at here. There's also, of course, some selective outrage and state hypocrisy involved. In the US context, positively referencing genocide through discourse is permissible so long as those in power choose not to condemn it or even to disguise it as just useful or youthful misdeeds. I guess maybe that was a Freudian slip that I said useful misdeeds because it would be in some cases potentially useful for those in power. Meanwhile, the U.S. government itself formally resists designating Gaza as genocide, even while providing military, financial, and diplomatic support to Israel. So, this dissonance shows how state power tolerates certain violence while punishing dissent, and often framing, oh, the other person's violence, that's what matters. Our violence is fine. It's the other person, the other side that you have to look out for. So then there's also an aspect that's bridging private hate to public policy. That's what I'm talking about here. These young Republican figures are not random trolls. Many already work in political institutions. If they carry forward the same violent imagination into legislation, regulation, enforcement, or foreign policy decisions, then the ideology of massacre is no longer metaphorical, it becomes material. So the pattern is clear: dehumanizing language presages dehumanizing policy. And Gaza is a contemporary manifestation of that. The genocidal conditions on the ground are increasingly undeniable. UN experts have warned that Gaza is undergoing relentless destruction of life and urged states to end the unfolding genocide. The asymmetry of power between Israel and the Palestinian population, the deliberate siege, the annihilation of civilian infrastructure, and mass displacement fit the model of genocide as structural and ongoing. And U.S. complicity and shielding is a major aspect of it too. So that's why when people might joke about things like this, it matters when people joke about genocides or violence. It actually does matter. Now, I'm not saying there are no contexts to ever do that, and maybe it's not always equally as offensive, right? Like, you probably know people in your personal life who have said things that could get them canceled, so to speak. But it is different when people are operating within a political party and they have actual positions of power. It matters what they think and what they say because it might have some qualities that carry over into what they do. So, despite mounting evidence and international pressure, U.S. officials repeatedly refuse to call the Gaza war genocide, even as they veto UN resolutions, shield Israel diplomatically, and continue arms transfers. And that ties into the dehumanization and the way you can see a population as just a joke or just a threat, or you just view them as abstract, like they're statisticals or statistical uh, entities or something like that. Statisticals. Oh, I just made up a word, I guess. Anyway, this is a choice to maintain space for mass violence while avoiding accountability. There's symbolic permissiveness involved. The normalization of genocidal speech in American political fringes, and of course it's debatable to what extent these people are even on the fringe anymore, but anyway, it signals to broader systems that extermination rhetoric is not disqualifying, that provides ideological cover for far more powerful actors to engage in genocide without even naming it as such. The normalization trickles upward. If young Republicans can casually praise gas chambers, it becomes harder to impose moral, legal, or political sanctions on actual state level massacre. So, again, that's why this matters. Genocide is not a fringe event. It is one of the most extreme expressions of state power over populations deemed disposable, when elites like J.D. Vance discard discourse policing and allow genocide jokes from rising political actors. They tacitly normalize that direction for state violence at all levels. So, not just in foreign policy, not just sometimes, but if it's common enough, if there's no pushback against it, well, it might normalize violence throughout society in general. Local policing. That's why they're trying to put the military into these what they call Democrat cities, but of course they're not just Democrat cities. They are cities where people live. They're trying to uh, send messages to the American people that will get you wherever you are. And if you disagree with the person at the top or the people at the top, well, maybe we'll designate you Antifa. Maybe we'll say you're pro Hamas. Maybe we'll say you are in a drug gang or some other type of organization like that. It doesn't matter if you are in such a group or not. Chances are you wouldn't be. The message is, we have overwhelming force and we can use it any way we want. And, any sort of violence that we want to employ is justified because we're the good guys, you're the bad guys. And then if some people they say a joke that is a little bit too edgy, well, that's not a problem. That's just kids being kids. It's not like their rhetorical violence is in any way linked to the real violence that the U.S. government is trying to implement. Again, all levels of society can be affected by this because it's part of the overt messaging. Genocide is no big deal. That's the whole thing there. And resistance to state violence must begin with vigilance over language. Unfortunately, look, I don't want to be a language cop myself, but especially when it comes to people who are in power, they need to be held accountable. They are supposed to be representatives after all. And of course, to some degree, sure, you should watch what you say in your own personal life too. That's a lesson that I've been a little bit slow to learn as I've gotten, more experience. I've become better at it. But when I was younger, I said offensive things pretty regularly. I saw it as being edgy or cool too. So, I'm not trying to get on the highest of horses here, but the point is when you have actual power, that power matters, and you are representing society in a very literal way. Even if you're representing society badly, I mean, maybe that's a more accurate representation of society. I don't know, but in any case, if you step out of line too far, well, you should be fired, if you're badly representing people and not doing your job, that's called legitimacy. So permitting genocide adjacent speech is a battlefield. The authoritarian logic, once safe in whispers, becomes policy when unchecked. Structural violence, that is, poverty, policing, and displacement, and overt violence, bombing, or mass murder, share the same ideological roots. Those who joke about extermination do not merely indulge in cruelty, they articulate the raw logic of disposability that so often underpins capitalism, colonialism, and the modern state in general. So in Gaza, in settler colonial zones, in war zones everywhere, the logic is the same. Your humanity is designed, the theft of your land is tolerated, your death is calculated, and when American political actors toy with that logic, they signal their readiness not only to tolerate, but to enable violent state outcomes. So, okay, that was quite a mouthful for me to say. Moving on to the next segment, I'm going to be talking about Peter Thiel. He is the peripheral poophead of the week. So, J.D. Vance's stint in venture capital played a surprisingly modest role in his public trajectory. After graduating from Yale Law, he briefly practiced at a corporate law firm and served as a Senate aide, but soon drifted into the tech finance world through connections in Silicon Valley. He joined Mithril Capital, a fund tied to Peter Thiel, in 2016, though by most accounts he was there for only about a year. One coworker later claimed he never saw Vance in Mithril offices during that time. So that's according to Fortune magazine. I don't know if you want to take them at their word. But in 2019, Vance co founded Narva Capital, or no, that's Naraya Capital. Uh, yeah, I think it's Narya Capital. Anyway, it's named after one of the elven rings in Tolkien lore. With a former Mithril colleague, reportedly Thiel and other heavyweight tech backers provided early capital. Under that banner, Vance made several high profile investments, some involving controversial firms, for instance, investments aligned with defense tech or platforms favored by right wing media. No surprise there, given his ultimate trajectory. Yet his uh, vulture capital career has been characterized as more rapid in ascent than in sustained deal making. Before examining Thiel, it's worth noting that Vance's political rise was materially aided by this access to elite capital. Thiel contributed substantial funds to Vance's 2022 Ohio Senate run. Some reports say around $15 million, dollars, according to CBS News. That infusion, combined with the status conferred by association with Silicon Valley, helped propel Vance's turn from tech insider into electoral heavyweight, unpopular though he may be overall. So yeah, that's also something I should mention, that J.D. Vance is not a particularly popular political figure, but he had some major money backing. So that includes Peter Thiel. He's a sign of power and contradictions. And interestingly enough, he of course had origins in what might be called the liberal order. So Peter Andreas Thiel, born on October 11th, 1967, so just recently his birthday happened. But anyway, he is a deeply consequential figure in tech, venture capital, or as just called it, venture or vulture capital. And of course, he's become a political patron. After emigrating as an infant from Germany, he grew up mostly in the US. So once again, we have another, white immigrant. So if you're a white immigrant, it's fine. You don't have to be scrutinized. You don't have to be demonized. But if you're a non-white immigrant, and if especially if you have a different religion or something like that, or dare I say it, if you're not a right-wing goofball, well, then you'll be scrutinized and demonized in right-wing media. But anyway, in 1998, Thiel co-founded Confinity, later PayPal, and served as CEO until eBay bought it in 2002 for $1.5 billion dollars, and it's a deal that vaulted him into serious wealth. Thiel went on to found Clarium Capital, a macro hedge fund, co-found Palantir in 2003, which is a data analytics company with deep ties to intelligence agencies, and he launched the Founders Fund in 2005 alongside former PayPal associates. So in 2004, he became the first external investor, I almost said advisor, but investor in Facebook, buying about 10.2% for $500,000. The kind of money most of us can find in our couch cushions. That's a joke, of course. And over the years, Thiel has also co founded or backed other funds like Valor Ventures and Mithril, that I mentioned earlier, and briefly served at Y Combinator. So, boy, they sure come up with the names for these companies. Combinator, Valor, VALAR, and yeah. So Thiel's latest net worth estimates vary depending on source. Forbes in May 2025 places it at approximately 20.8 billion, ranking him among the world's wealthiest, though he's actually oddly enough nowhere near the top. Other sources give lower or conflicting figures, but most agree he remains in the multi-billion dollar stratum. And so he's a rich guy, so of course he's connected with politics. We keep on getting this message that these people they're outsiders, they're like renegades, they're anti-establishment or whatever, but they are the establishment. I mean, let's face it, they're rich elites. That's what they are. They're not like the rest of us. He yields influence not only through capital but through political patronage. Like I said, Thiel has been variously labeled a libertarian, though I don't know when the liberty part comes in. He's a skeptic of democratic norms, or even a democracy skeptic authoritarian, as some people have called him. So yeah, where does the liberty part come in? The liberty is just for the wealthy. That's their idea of what liberty entails. If you have money, you have power and influence, and that's the narrow definition of freedom for these people. So he runs the Thiel Foundation, which funds breakout labs, and the Thiel Fellowship, a program that's just for supposed innovators or whatever you want to call them. In 2016, he secretly bankrolled the Hulk Hogan lawsuit against Gawker after Gawker outed Peter Thiel as gay, and it's something he later acknowledged to doing. So he's a little bit petty and vindictive. Now you might say, "Oh, Gawker maybe shouldn't have outed him or whatever," but whatever. It's one of those things. Uh, Over time, Thiel has donated handsomely to right wing or populist causes and candidates, and that's probably why Gawker outed him in the first place. So from a radical lens. Like I often look at how these people and these stories sort of verify the radical left wing views of the world. So, from a sort of anarchic lens, Teal's trajectory, cleansed of romanticism, reads like a concentrated form of counterinsurgency. His pro innovation rhetoric hides a functioning system of oligarchic control. He helps seed platforms, some with military or surveillance use, backs political allies, and pressures systems of regulation to favor monopoly rather than competition. Palantir, for example, has been criticized for enabling state surveillance and predictive policing. So he is part of the government. Make no mistake about it. He is like an unelected source of political power. He's he's almost as much as a politician in terms of power. In fact, you might even say in some ways he actually has more power than the average politician, even in Congress or the Senate, because he's got so much wealth. And wealth, of course, in our society and our structure of governance is power. That's how the cultural system is designed for us to view these people. We're supposed to see them as being more powerful than us. We see the dollar bill as having legitimacy. Everything has a dollar sign attached to it. It's like the biggest foundational value in our society, and our media, of course, plays that game too, making it seem like power and money are legitimacy. But of course they're not, because power and money can encourage deceit and lying. It shields people from accountability or for their wrongdoing. All sorts of stuff like that. So money is not the be all end all of existence, but culturally we constantly have it jackhammered into our brains that money is the only thing that matters. And that's why people like Peter Thiel matter. It's really the only reason that he matters is that he's rich, because you could say that he's made some good business decisions, and he's got a lot of clout in that sense. But other than that, people really wouldn't even know who he is. I mean, he's obviously not much of a celebrity. If you've ever seen him speak or anything like that, he's very awkward, clumsy, and awkward. Even more so than I am. I can be a little bit of a klutz when I talk, but he's like only famous because of his business connections. He was a lucky guy, and because luck does have a part of it. Also, just the fact that he didn't have a system placing a bunch of hurdles in his way, because he had accumulated money at some point. If he was like just a regular ordinary person, and he had limited opportunities, some sort of discrimination against him. Doesn't matter so much what sort of discrimination. I'm just generalizing here. But if he had way more hurdles in his way, we would have never heard of this guy. I'll just put it like that. So he openly questions whether liberal democracy is even a viable framework for advanced technological society. Well, it kind of is. It kind of is, actually, Pete. You might not think so, but it actually kind of is. In fact, it is the only viable framework for such a society as we're finding out now, because guess what? Our advanced technological society is kind of crumbling because of or people like Peter Thiel. Peter like people Thiel is almost what I was going to say. Like a bit of dyslexia, maybe. Maybe I should get that checked out. But anyway, he sees democracy as incompatible with disciplined long-term planning. But as we've seen with Elon Musk going in there with Doge, which again was just named after a meme coin, which shows how juvenile his brain was and still is. Well, we saw with that he basically destroyed a good chunk of society. You know, is he could only throw people out of work, really, and have no plan to replace these institutions with anything better. And the targeting of US aid, for example, well, that's estimated that it could actually end up killing millions of people. So there's a genocidal component of it to tie into the earlier theme. And, they don't know what they're doing. They fire people and then they hire them back. So it's just chaos. They are the source of a lot of society's chaos and lack of discipline. But you won't catch the media often saying that, though. So, this anti-liberal flair recurs in his public remarks, and you're just going to hear that messaging as the charade of politics goes on. So, all right, I'm tired of talking about Peter Thiel. Let's move on to the next clown. This is the segment that I call the fetid fever dream of the week. And we're talking about somebody named Ken Howery, who you've probably heard even less about than Peter Thiel. I just learned about him today, and it turns out he actually has some power. In 2005, Peter Thiel launched Founders Fund with PayPal partners Ken Howery and Luke Nosek. So, Ken Howery, I wanted to look at some scandals that could be considered the fever dream flashback, and it's a little bit hard to find a specific one. I couldn't find a well documented, generally accepted biggest scandal that isolates Ken Howery as the subject in the way many public figures have at least one defining controversy. But there are recent controversies which implicate him because of his role as a tech investor, a diplomat, and political appointee, especially tied to the Greenland proposal, as it's sometimes called. So I'll summarize what is known, then try to assess things from, again, sort of an anarchic perspective to look at how this clown's existence actually kind of verifies the wacky and goofball anarchic claims about how the system of government works. So, what's going on that's controversial? The main allegations or criticism linked to Ken Howery are the Greenland purchase or the ownership or control of Greenland. Donald Trump, when announcing Ken Howery as the ambassador to Denmark, stated, quote, "For purposes of national security and freedom throughout the world, the United States of America feels that the ownership and control of Greenland is an absolute necessity," end quote. So this has revived earlier friction. Greenland's prime minister has said Greenland is not for sale and never will be. The idea raises questions of sovereignty, colonial attitudes, and geopolitical leverage. You've got tech power, capital concentration, and influence involved because Howery is a co founder of PayPal, partners at Founders Fund, early investor in many high profile tech firms. His wealth influence in tech and vulture capital, and closeness to figures like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk deservedly should draw scrutiny. And maybe this guy was picked a little bit because he's not famous. I don't know. I mean, I guess he's famous. Semi-famous, but you don't hear about this guy very much. So he's definitely somebody who's a little bit behind the scenes. So the Founders Fund itself has been criticized over its investments, its alignment with powerful tech firms, its political associations through Thiel, and the broader social impacts of those firms when it comes to privacy, labor, regulatory capture, etc. So while many criticisms are aimed more broadly at vulture capital in Silicon Valley, Howery is actually a part of that structure. So let's explore his diplomatic role and politics. Howery's roles as U.S. ambassador to Sweden and Denmark, place him at the intersection of policy, geopolitics, and business. Some see his appointment in the Greenland controversy as a way to further Trump's territorial and geostrategic ambitions, to use a big word. So there is potential conflict, of course. Well, it's more than potential, it's like fully realized, representing U.S. government diplomatic positions while being embedded in private capital structures that might benefit from resource extraction, infrastructure, or other geopolitical advantages in places like Greenland. It's a conflict of interest, and critics like myself worry about the possibility that business interests will influence or drive diplomatic actions because money is a powerful motivator, and these people want to get more money for themselves. And who cares about the populations? They don't care. They want a bigger slice of the pie every time. So there's also the public perception and arrogance of empire aspect to all of this. They're trying to find a proper way to message when it comes to expanding and stealing Greenland, but so far they've been floundering when it comes to that messaging. Many see the Greenland proposal as emblematic of a kind of 21st century colonial or imperial mindset, and those many people would be right. Buying land, control, ownership of places with distinct peoples, cultures, and political autonomy is really something that an imperial mindset would want to do. So the backlash from Greenland's own government and from Denmark is in part, uh, it's a part of that perception. So is it a scandal? Well, yes, it is. Whether this counts as a scandal, I guess depends on what definitions are used, but it's seen as scandalous by most people, just like the threats against Canada. The United States has also said that it wants to take over Canada, or at least the United States under Trump, to be exact. And if you define scandal as involving wrongdoing, legal or ethical violations, or public humiliation, then the Greenland proposal is controversial, but not so far proven illegal in any way directly tied to Howery or even aside from that. Technically, as far as I know, it's not illegal for a U.S. president to threaten to attain more territory. So, yeah, that's a little bit of an interesting uh, thing to consider here. I mean, it's not just a legal question; it's more of an ethical and uh, strategic question, you might say. So, there's no public record in my searches of Howery being convicted or formally found liable for misconduct, whether fraud or corruption or anything like that. So it's more a matter of ethical criticism, transparency, political risk, and geopolitical tension. So the biggest scandal might be this Greenland issue because it touches sovereignty, colonial legacy, and potentially misusing diplomatic power or conflation of business and state, which is, of course, what they want to do. They want to merge business and government to be as one completely and totally. Whereas before there was at least some distinction that was made, but now it's just government by the rich and for the rich. And if you're not somebody who aligns with their interests, well, you can go take a hike. Maybe you'll end up in one of their fancy private prisons or uh, just obliterated in a missile strike or something like that. Maybe you'll end up designated as a gang member or something like that. Any number of things. Antifa, maybe you're Antifa if you don't like what they have to say. So again, this feeds into that pesky silly Billy anarchic perspective that I was talking about, it really goes further to really verify those sorts of views. So, from an anarchic viewpoint, which tends to emphasize individual autonomy, opposition to coercive state power, skepticism of hierarchical authority, and often values the rights of communities to self governance, well, here's an assessment related to that. So, an anarchist ethic generally affirms that peoples and communities have the right to govern themselves, to define their political status, free from external imposition. The idea of a state, in this case the US, acquiring ownership or control over Greenland violates that principle. In fact, you might have to wonder, as like a broader principle, why would anybody feel the need to say they own or control a territory? You might actually expand even more into those broader implications and questions, and especially if you consider that ownership and control are actually kind of illusions in the first place. I mean, it's not like there's no validity to the idea of ownership, but it's actually something that we kind of create in our own minds. So it has legitimate aspects to it potentially, but limited legitimacy as well. Because there are certain contexts where the concept of ownership it just falls flat, and it becomes something other than a thing that empowers people. It can become a tool of oppression. You know what I'm saying? So like if you claim, oh, I own my toothbrush, that's fine. At least for most people, it would be fine, right? But that's different from saying, oh, I own the country, or my group of people owns the country, or whatever. If you're keeping other people out of your decision making, yet your decision making would impact their lives and their environment, their resources, etc., well, then you are using the general concept of ownership as a tool of oppression, as a justification for what is ultimately sort of a violent ideology, because you're depriving them from having a say in how society functions. So, Greenlanders have expressed that they are not for sale, their autonomy is being ignored or overridden in rhetoric. That suggests deeply colonial attitudes, that land and people are just transferable assets. They're like abstractions. The people are just like numbers, they're statistics, they're they're just an afterthought at best. At best they're an afterthought, and at worst, they could be declared enemies of some type. So that's the nature of state power and imperialism. All too often in history, the state or states are being used as instruments for expansion, resource extraction, and strategic power. So those goofball anarchists would critique how states act in concert with capitalist interests to appropriate land, resources, and geopolitical influence. So Howry's dual identity as diplomat plus vulture capitalist could be seen as symptomatic of the fusion of state with capital, where state instruments are leveraged to benefit private power. So, capitalist influence and inequality go hand in hand. Big tech capital, the vulture capitalist stuff, and political influence tend to concentrate wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands as time goes on. So, Howery's role in Founders Fund, his influence on tech investments and political appointments, they're problematic because they enable power imbalances, that is, economic, social, and global. If diplomatic appointments are given to those deeply embedded in capital rather than public interest or local governance, that blurs the boundary between democratic legitimacy and plutocratic influence. So often, You know, even though they are functioning like they are dictatorial, they still want to have the appearance of some democratic legitimacy. Even if you look into history of kings and whatnot, they still want to seem like they are kings who at least occasionally have the people's interests at heart, even if they rarely ever do. So, of course, ethics and consent are one of the main aspects of this. From anarchic goofiness, from that perspective, legitimacy arises through consent. If Greenland or any community does not consent to being owned or controlled by another state, that plan is illegitimate. Also, transparency and accountability are key. Many of the decisions are being floated in public declarations, media speculation, or political rhetoric. If there's no full democratic process in Greenland or Denmark involving their peoples, there's an ethical failing there. So let's say the people of Greenland wanted to actually become part of the United States. That'd be a different matter entirely. There could still be potential for resistance to that, but if the overwhelming majority of the people there wanted it, there'd be less of a scandal. So, anarchism generally encourages local grassroots resistance to state overreach and the public rejection by Greenland's authorities. We are not for sale, that whole thing is actually in line with what anarchists would consider appropriate resistance, civic autonomy, asserting local self-determination, and so on. That's a part of this whole issue that is interesting. Like the way that the so-called radical point of view of all this is actually tying in with the mainstream point of view that self determination matters. The ability to say no and say we're not for sale or we're not going to be conquered or whatever. You know, the, the the fact that the radical is merging with the mainstream on that one is, it's worth noting. So while I can't point to a single scandal in the sense of a proven legal wrongdoing by Howery, at least not yet, the Greenland proposal is the most significant controversy that he's associated with, and it's especially true due to its imperial overtones, potential conflicts of interest, and implications for sovereignty. So, from the wacky, Fozzie Bear style angle of the radical anarchic worldview, the controversy highlights many classic issues: state domination, capitalist influence, colonialism, and lack of true self determination for the communities being impacted. So, if one aligns with, those so called radical principles, much of what is happening here would indeed be a problem. So, you know, are you a radical if you oppose this type of thing? Well, I don't think so, but it it's one of those things that further verifies the so-called extreme left-wing point of view that if you're being conquered, it's not a legitimate thing. It should be up to you to decide if you want to be a part of uh, the United States or any other government. You shouldn't just be violently attacked and taken over like Putin is trying to do with Russia, and as Trump is trying to do with other countries right now as we speak, including even Canada. So, nobody is safe from this wannabe dictator, and that's why the No Kings protests are springing up pretty soon this weekend.